What's up guys, I actually uploaded my Sucrose guide pretty late last night and I didn't catch a couple errors that I made, so I wanted to re-upload this and fix it. What a re-upload means is that this is going to destroy me in the algorithm, so I would really appreciate if you guys watched through the entire video and gave it a like, so that way it doesn't end up being my least viewed video and is actually able to go somewhere in the algorithm. Thank you guys so much. Sucrose is an amazing support, and honestly if Kazuha and Venti didn't exist, she'd definitely be one of the most used units. She has an 18% Spiral Abyss usage already. She's well-rounded and amazing in normal play, and though you might see her mostly in damage showcases, she works great in other content too. If you don't have access to Venti or Kazuha, but you're still looking for great utility, Sucrose is your girl. So in this guide today, I'm going to tell you why Sucrose is good, how to build her artifacts, what her best weapons are, and what her best team compositions are. Before we talk about why Sucrose is good and how to build her, I just want to let you know that I go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone. Follow there if you want to see live content and testing, and also make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy because it really helps me out. So let's talk about what makes Sucrose good. Sucrose has access to a lot of tools that other characters don't. Her burst is a grouping utility. Whenever you use it, you're going to be able to group up tons of enemies, and it repeatedly applies elemental auras and damage. But what makes Sucrose really strong is that she has two passives that both buff your team's elemental mastery depending on certain circumstances. Like the first one will buff all units that use the same element of damage that she swirls, and passive 2 will make it so that your team gets 20% of Sucrose's elemental mastery whenever she hits an enemy with an ability. Another thing that makes Sucrose really strong is that she's able to hold Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, which is a book that buffs another party member after switching off of Sucrose. Sucrose is also able to amplify fall damage and cause fall damage in some cases, so if you're using someone like Jean or if you're using an overload comp, you can pull enemies down to the ground faster with her skill and it does extra damage. It's just so much utility. On top of that, her constellations are really strong. Like her Constellation 1 gives her an extra charge for her elemental skill, which generates a ton of particles and will help her battery herself to get her burst up and just be a good source of extra damage. Her Constellation 2 extends her burst duration by 2 seconds, which is a decent buff. Her Constellation 4 makes Sucrose's skill cooldown reduced by a second every 7 hits from her autos or charged attacks, and it's really only super useful in Taser comp, which we'll talk about later, but overall gets a lot of value. And her Constellation 6 makes it so that when you use her burst, the infused element gets a damage buff of 20% across your whole team for 8 seconds. So it's essentially a 500 elemental mastery Kazuha buff, and it's really strong with Viridescent Venerer. On top of that, certain characters can also snapshot that buff. So a snapshot, for those of you who don't know, means that a character's stat will freeze the moment they use a specific ability. So for example, Xiangling's Pyro NATO will keep the pyro damage bonus from C6 even after the duration of Sucrose's burst ends. So that was a lot, but that's basically why Sucrose is good. She has a lot of things going for her. So speaking of sets, we just mentioned the Viridescent Venerer set, and we're going to talk about what her best artifacts are. So the reason Viridescent Venerer is her best set is because it gives a 60% swirl damage increase, which is really big for someone who's building elemental mastery, and it makes enemies lose 40% of their elemental resistance to swirled elements. So that means if you're using a pyro carry and you swirl pyro, the enemies are going to take extra pyro damage in comparison to what they would have if you hadn't swirled pyro. Because she's an anemo character, she's one of the few characters in the game that can actually use this set, so you don't want to give her something like Noblesse unless you already have a swirler on your team. Honestly though, that's literally the only set you want to run. Like, you just want to run Viridescent Venerer and nothing else. The one tough thing about building Sucrose is finding the right main stat artifacts though, because when you build her, you're going to want to build all elemental mastery on her Sands, Goblet, and Circlet, all of them, every single one. There is a point where elemental mastery diminishes more and you want to stop building it, but you're just probably not going to ever hit that point with Sucrose. It's really high. But unfortunately, elemental mastery is the rarest main stat in the game, so farming for it on Viridescent can be really hard. If you have to choose between running Viridescent Venerer 4-piece or running a broken set with all elemental mastery, choose the Viridescent set. The debuff you're going to hit on enemies is really important. But especially since the 1.6 patch buffed elemental mastery and swirl damage, you're going to want to take the time to go for elemental mastery Viridescent artifacts eventually anyways, so it's worth farming for, trust me. On the bright side, those substats are really easy on Sucrose because you don't need any crit at all. For her substats, Elemental Mastery is number 1, but her energy recharge is the next most important thing. Sucrose Burst costs 80 energy, so she wants to sit at a higher energy recharge to be more comfy, and most 80 cost bursts want to be around 160 energy recharge, which will be really hard to get from just artifacts, so that's why it's important to roll it in the substats as much as you can. After those stats though, attack percent ends up being the next best thing, since building Sucrose with EM will make her attack stat lower and overall output less damage. So you might be wondering, Brax, what about DPS Sucrose? Well, Elemental Mastery Sucrose kind of is DPS Sucrose. Sure, you're not going to hit like 30k elemental skills, and if you look at a Sucrose damage showcase, they're probably going to go for like as high of a hit as they can, but you're going to be doing a lot of swirl damage. Like as you could see in the opening clip of the video, we just hit a lot of swirls in conjunction with Beto ult and Xingqiu ult, and overall the value you get from Elemental Mastery on Sucrose's kit is so much that it's more worth the builder with Elemental Mastery anyways. The one exception to this is if you build a mono comp, so a composition using only one element and anemo or geo, specifically something where you're not going to use a lot of reactions, then you can opt for attack, anemo damage, and crit on Sucrose if you want to, but I still think Elemental Mastery is probably the safest bet across the board, especially because of her weapons that we're going to get into. So as far as weapons go, this is really simple too. So there's basically 4 weapons in the game right now that you want to run with Sucrose. The number 1 weapon is Sacrificial Fragments because it has a chance to give you a charge back on your elemental skill, which lets you swirl more, group enemies more, and charge your burst faster. But even more importantly than that, it has an Elemental Mastery main stat that scales really high. It is a gacha weapon, so not everyone's going to have it. If you don't have Sacrificial Fragments, Magic Guide is a solid 3-star weapon you can get randomly from the gacha as well. Its passive isn't super good since you're not building Sucrose's attack very high, but its Elemental Mastery stat is really helpful and higher than Mappa Mare, which is the free-to-play 4-star craftable. If you weren't able to get Magic Guide, you can craft Mappa Mare instead, which has a lower Elemental Mastery than Magic Guide, and for that reason isn't a top pick, but it's still pretty good. And the 4th weapon is also free-to-play friendly. It's Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. So the main stat is HP, and it doesn't benefit Sucrose for that reason, but the passive of it is ridiculously strong. The character you switch to after having Sucrose with Thrilling Tales out gets a massive attack buff, and since Thrilling Tales is easy to refine, you should be able to make that attack buff maxed out really quickly. I would recommend using Thrilling Tales if you don't mind doing slightly less damage with Sucrose in exchange for a ton more damage on your main carry. This is the weapon that people use to hit clickbait damage, and it's really solid. I wouldn't use it in Taser comp though, which is going to be the first team that we're going to talk about here in a second. Basically, the TLDR of the build section is 4-piece Viridescent Fenrir, Elemental Mastery, Elemental Mastery, Elemental Mastery, Energy Recharge substats are good, and for weapons use Sacrificial Fragments, Magic Guide, Mappa Mare, or Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. If for some reason you don't build Elemental Mastery, which is, you shouldn't do that, build Elemental Mastery unless you're playing a mono comp. Any of the 5-star books will be good in that case, and honestly, if you're going to go that route anyways, you might as well build attack percent, anemo damage, and crit, but don't do it, it's a trap. Anyways, team time. So the team that I was using in the opening clip was her Taser team, and that has Xingqiu, Fischl, and Beto. The idea is that you want to have swirlable elements as off-field DPS that you can kind of control with your auto attacks. So every time that Sucrose attacks, she has the opportunity to swirl, and Electrocharge is being applied consistently as well. So it's a really powerful team, especially if you're sharing Elemental Mastery. And if you have Raiden, you can actually substitute Fischl for her as well, and that will also work very, very well. You can technically use other characters like Xiangling or Albedo, but you're going to get less value out of something like Xiangling because you can't really control it as well. And Albedo just doesn't swirl, so there's not really a point. Like, it doesn't fit into the concept of the team. Outside of Taser, Sucrose is really flexible. She's decent in mono element compositions with C6, but she's great in compositions that rely on big reaction damage like Vaporize and Melt comps. So for example, you can use Sucrose with someone like Hu Tao and Xingqiu to buff Hu Tao's Elemental Mastery when she's doing Vaporize damage, and that'll make her charged attacks do a lot more. You can also replace Hu Tao with any Pyro that works with Xingqiu in this case. So characters like Yanfei, D-Luke, all the Pyro DPS in the game honestly can work pretty well. She's also great in reverse melt with Ganyu and Xiangling, where if you infuse Sucrose's burst with Pyro, Ganyu will be able to get a few strong EM boosted melts off, and it'll be really powerful. Overall, Sucrose is just super flexible and a very powerful unit in any team that deals with elemental damage that isn't Geo. Sucrose has some of the worst synergy in the game with Geo since her entire kit revolves around reactions and elemental mastery, but you can still run someone like Noelle or Zhongli with her, it's just that they won't be contributing to her damage. That's basically all you need to know about building Sucrose. The one last thing I want to say before you go and build her is not to do this. It's disgusting. Hey everyone, YouTube Members is live on this channel. Finally, you can become a member of the channel if you're interested to get exclusive emotes, a special badge next to your name, special contact with me, a special name color when you're in YouTube live streams, and so much more. I encourage you to click the link down in the description and look into becoming a YouTube member if you're interested in supporting the channel. Thanks to our current members already, and I will see you guys later.